All right, hello everyone. I'm Ame Latour, a staff writer at Ballotpedia, and thank you for being here today. We're going to be talking about redistricting. This is a topic we at Ballotpedia expected to spend a lot of time on in 2021, but we didn't quite anticipate the way that we would be doing so. As with so many other things, the coronavirus pandemic had a big effect on the data collection for the 2020 census. States use that population data for redistricting. The data is also used for congressional apportionment, and that means determining how many seats each state gets in the US House of Representatives. The Census Bureau is expected to release its apportionment counts next week, and some states are expected to gain seats, some states are expected to lose seats. Our redistricting expert, Jarek Adams, is here to talk with me about this very unique redistricting cycle. Thanks for being with us, Jarek.
Thank you, I'm glad to be here.
Great, so let's start with apportionment. Tell us a bit about that.
The Constitution requires that congressional representatives be apportioned to the states on the basis of population. So there are 435 seats in the US House. Each state is allotted a portion of those seats based on the size of its population relative to the other states. Every 10 years, seats in the US House are reapportioned in accordance with the results of the census. A state might gain seats in the House if its population grows or lose seats if its population.
Okay, so when the Census Bureau releases apportionment counts next week, which states do you think will gain seats?
The most recent projections show Florida and Texas each gaining multiple seats, and 5 states are poised to gain 1 seat each: Arizona, Colorado, Montana, North Carolina, and Oregon.
All right, and some states are probably going to lose seats too, right?
Right. Current projections have New York losing potentially multiple seats. Another 8 states could lose 1 seat each: California, Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and West Virginia.
Okay, so let's move on to the redistricting process itself. Now, what we're going to talk about for the next couple minutes will be familiar to anyone who caught our Redistricting 101 briefing back in February, but a refresher never hurts. And we also want to make sure that we're covering these basics for anyone who's watching for the first time. So, Jarek, tell me a bit about redistricting. What is it?
Redistricting is the process by which the maps for electoral districts are drawn. That encompasses congressional, state legislative, and municipal districts, such as those used for city and county councils and school boards. Broadly speaking, redistricting applies to nearly every legislative body in the country at the federal, state, and local levels.
All right, and can you give us a brief overview of how this process works?
So every 10 years, once the US Census has been completed, the Census Bureau delivers detailed population data sets to the states. The redistricting authorities in these states then use the data to redraw their district maps, be they congressional, state legislative, or otherwise.
Okay, now who's responsible for redistricting in the states? I know it's usually state legislatures, but that's not always the case, right?
Right, so there are 3 basic models for redistricting authority. The first and the most common is legislature dominant. In a legislature dominant system, the state legislature retains the ultimate authority to draft and enact new maps. There are also commission dominant systems, in which commissions, as opposed to legislatures, retain final redistricting authority. And finally, there are a few hybrid systems in which legislatures share redistricting authority with commissions.
Okay, so tell us more about legislature dominant redistricting systems.
There are 3 main varieties of legislature dominant systems. The first and the most common is a system in which the governor can veto maps adopted by the state legislature. There's also a smaller group of states in which the governors cannot veto maps. And lastly, there are states in which advisory commissions are also involved in the process. These commissions can recommend maps to the legislatures, but the legislatures themselves are not obligated to adopt the recommendations. They can do so, of course, but they can also amend the recommendation.
Okay, so what about commission systems?
Commission systems take one of two forms. First, there are non-politician commissions, which are often referred to as independent commissions. These commissions are marked by the absence of elective office holders, like state lawmakers, secretaries of state, etc. Second, there are politician commissions in which these elective office holders can participate.
Okay, so tell us more about the hybrid systems. I haven't heard as much about these.
Sure. This is actually a category that we devised to represent some of the unique redistricting reforms that the states have made via ballot measure over the last few years. In essence, hybrid systems split the difference between legislature dominant and commission systems, vesting authority with both types of entities. Virginia's system, which voters approved last fall by ballot measure, would be a good case in point.
All right, well, thanks for that overview of who's responsible for redistricting. Now, what are some of the rules that apply? I know that districts generally have to have nearly equal populations, but is there any degree of variance allowed there?
Yes, districts do generally have to have nearly equal populations. When it comes to US House districts, a population spread of 1% or more is generally considered suspect constitutionally. There's a little more leeway when it comes to state legislative districts. A spread of 10% or more will generally not be upheld by a court if a challenge is made.
All right, so how did these standards develop? Are they laid out in federal law or were they established by the courts?
These standards are not made explicit in federal law, but they've instead been established by court precedent. The US Supreme Court issued two rulings on this topic in 1964. Westbury versus Sanders, which applies to US House districts, and Reynolds versus Sims, which applies to state legislative districts.
All right, so are there other federal requirements that authorities have to take into account while they're redistricting?
Just one, really. Federal law requires that districts cannot discriminate on the basis of race or ethnicity. And often, when district maps are thrown out by the courts, it's this requirement that serves as the basis for that decision.
Okay, and what about the states themselves? Do the states enforce their own rules, like above and beyond what the federal government's rules are?
Yeah, some states do enforce extra requirements. Requirements that districts be physically adjacent are the most common. Most states also require that districts adhere to existing political boundaries. That would be things like county and city lines, wherever possible. Some states also require that districts be compact and preserve communities of common interests. That would encompass things like socioeconomic or ethnic groups.
All right, well, thanks. Now that we've covered some of those basics, let's talk about some recent developments that stand to have a major impact on redistricting in the coming cycle. The Census Bureau has not finalized redistricting data sets yet, right?
That's right. Back in February, the Census Bureau said that it would release granular redistricting data by September 30th. And just last month, the Bureau said it could make the data available in a legacy format in mid to late August of this year. The legacy format would present the data in a sort of raw form, without the data tables and other access tools that the Bureau will ultimately put together for the states by September 30th.
Okay, so these are pretty significant departures from original deadlines, is that right?
Right. So under its original operational timeline, the Census Bureau was expected to deliver redistricting data to the states by March 31st of this year.
Okay. So two states are holding legislative elections this year. New Jersey is holding elections for both its legislative chambers, and Virginia is holding elections for the House of Delegates. How will the Census Bureau's revised timeline affect elections in those states?
Last fall, voters in New Jersey approved public question number 3, which was a constitutional amendment postponing state legislative redistricting until after this year's elections, if the Census Bureau failed to deliver the data by February 15th of this year. So as a result, the existing New Jersey legislative district maps are going to remain in place until 2023.
Okay, so what about Virginia?
It's been less explicit in Virginia, but it's pretty much certain that legislative candidates there will run under the existing maps this year. Delegate Marcus Simon, who's a member of Virginia's Redistricting Commission, said recently, quote, "This year everybody seems to be acknowledging we'll run with the existing lines. That's not really the question. The question is, what do we do after that?"
All right, well, thank you. So what about the other 48 states?
So even states that are not conducting regular elections this year will have to contend with their own redistricting deadlines. In some states, these deadlines are laid out explicitly in state constitutions. Changing these deadlines generally requires either a constitutional amendment, as we just discussed for New Jersey, or a court order. In other states, the deadlines are fixed by statute. Legislatures can alter these deadlines at their discretion. In still other states, redistricting deadlines are not made explicit at all, but they can be inferred from things like candidate filing.
Oh, okay. So when are these deadlines? Do they tend to all happen around the same time, or are they more spread out?
The deadlines vary pretty widely from state to state, and there are often different deadlines for different types of maps even within a state. So for instance, in some states, congressional maps might be due at different times than state legislative maps. By my most recent count, there are 12 states in which the applicable deadlines ostensibly require that congressional maps be finalized before year's end. And there are 23 states in which the deadlines require that state legislative maps be finalized on or before December 31st of this year.
All right, thanks. So it seems like the Census Bureau's current timeline for delivering data is going to conflict with state redistricting deadlines.
Absolutely. The current timeline is going to force many states to begin their redistricting processes much later in the year. This increases the likelihood that implementation of new maps is going to push up against candidate filing deadlines. And these issues are only going to be exacerbated by what we anticipate to be a sort of unprecedented barrage of legal challenges to maps after they're enacted. So I think we can expect a particularly volatile redistricting cycle over the next year or so.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Okay, so what kinds of responses are we seeing from the states so far?
So as with all things that involve redistricting, there's been a broad assortment of responses. These range from lawsuits, proposals to postpone or condense redistricting timelines, and even calls for postponing primaries and candidate filing deadlines.
All right, well, let's start with the lawsuits. What kind of lawsuits are we seeing?
Ohio seems to have been the first state to pursue litigation over the delays. Back in February, the state filed suit against the Census Bureau in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Ohio. Benjamin Flowers, who's the state solicitor general, argued that, quote, "the unavailability of census data irreparably harms the state by preventing it from conducting redistricting in the constitutionally preferred manner. That is, using census data as opposed to data from an alternative source, which some folks have been suggesting." On March 24th, Judge Thomas Rose dismissed the lawsuit, writing in his order that, quote, "the court cannot order a party to jump higher, run faster, or lift more than she is physically capable." The state appealed Rose's decision to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, where it's currently pending.
Okay, so have any other states sued over these delays?
Yeah, actually, just last month, the state of Alabama filed its own lawsuit against the Census Bureau in the District Court for the Middle District of Alabama. Alabama is challenging not only the revised timeline for delivering apportionment counts and redistricting data, it's also challenging the Census Bureau's use of a very specific statistical method that it argues will prevent Alabama from having, quote, "accurate information about where Alabamians actually live." On March 26th, the court ordered that a 3-judge panel be convened to consider the case, which is pretty common in redistricting related lawsuits. And late last week, 16 states joined together and filed an amicus brief in support of Alabama's position. Those 16 states are Alaska, Arkansas, Florida, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maine, Mississippi, Montana, Nebraska, New Mexico, Ohio, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Texas, Utah, and West Virginia.
Okay, thank you. And what about state-specific changes to redistricting timelines? How are states approaching that?
Oregon is a really interesting case in point. Under Article 4, Section 6 of the state constitution, the legislature has until July 1st of this year to adopt new legislative district maps. If the legislature fails to adopt new maps, the Secretary of State would have until August 15th to do so. Now, those deadlines obviously conflict with the target dates laid out by the Census Bureau that we've been talking about. So last month, the Speaker of the Oregon State House and the President of the Oregon State Senate, on behalf of the Oregon Legislative Assembly, sued the Secretary of State in the Oregon Supreme Court. They asked the court to extend the deadlines laid out in the state constitution. In their complaint, attorneys for the plaintiffs said, quote, "Unless this court enjoins the Secretary of State from moving forward with apportionment and extends the deadline set forth in Article 4, Section 6, reapportionment will either not be done at all or will be done using old census data that will resort in malapportioned legislative districts. Neither result is constitutionally palatable."
Oh, it's a really interesting case. Has the court responded yet?
Yes, just a little over a week ago, the court issued its ruling in the case. The court established a timeline under which the state legislature will have until September 27th to adopt its own plan. The Secretary of State will have until October 18th to adopt a plan if the legislature misses its deadline. And writing for the court, Chief Justice Martha Walters said, quote, "The deadlines set out in the court's opinion provide participants with substantially the same amount of time they would have had under the deadlines set out in Article 4, Section 6, and a plan will be final no later than February 8th, 2022. The Legislative Assembly and the Secretary will have less time to work with the census data than would be true in an ordinary year, but the Secretary has assured us that both will have the use of non-census population data that should enable their work to begin well before the census data is delivered."
All right, so you said earlier that some states are even considering postponing primary elections. Can you tell us more about that?
Texas is probably the most noteworthy example of this. Under Senate Bill 1822, Texas's primary election, which is currently scheduled for March 1st, 2022, would be postponed to April 5th if a redistricting plan is enacted after November 22nd of this year and on or before January 3rd, 2022. If a plan is enacted between January 3rd of next year and February 14th, the primary would be further postponed to May 24th, 2022. And the attendant candidate filing deadlines and primary runoff dates would also be shifted accordingly.
All right, so has that proposal made significant headway in the state legislature?
It has. The state Senate approved the plan unanimously just last week. It's pending now in the state House, where it's awaiting review by the Chamber's Redistricting Committee. Given the unanimous support in the Senate, it seems the proposal has a good chance of becoming law. It remains to be seen whether other states will follow suit and consider postponing their own primaries.
Well, great. This is all great context as we head into the 2020 redistricting cycle. Thanks, Jarek, for taking the time to talk about it.
My pleasure.
So we want to invite everyone to donate to Ballotpedia to help us consider continue our in-depth coverage of redistricting elections and much more. I want to drop a link in for you all to do that. I have to apologize. I'm actually having a little trouble with Zoom, so I'm not able to drop those in right now. Jarek or Kayla, I'll ask if you're able to do that, to please share the link with everyone to where we can donate. So we invited readers to submit questions ahead of today's briefing, and we're going to look at a few of those now. First, we have a question about the new redistricting commission formed in New Mexico earlier this month. Jarek, how does that fit into the classification system we discussed earlier?
New Mexico's redistricting commission will comprise 7 members, none of whom can be public officials or political party office holders. The commission will not be able to enact maps on its own. Instead, it will submit proposals to the state legislature, which can adopt, modify, or discard those proposals as it sees fit. Because this commission has only advisory authority, we would classify New Mexico's redistricting process as legislature dominant.
All right, great, thank you. Another question we have, what has the US Supreme Court said about partisan gerrymandering?
So in 2019, the court issued a 5-4 joint ruling in Rucho versus Common Cause and Limon versus Benesek, finding that partisan gerrymandering claims present political questions that fall beyond the jurisdiction of the federal judiciary. Chief Justice John Roberts penned the majority opinion, in which he wrote, "The federal courts are not equipped to apportion political power as a matter of fairness, nor is there any basis for concluding that they were authorized to do so."
Great, thank you. So we've also received a few questions about HR 1, the election policy bill being considered in Congress this session. What kinds of redistricting provisions does that bill contain?
Yeah, HR 1's interesting. There's been a lot of attention given to the voting provisions, but less to the redistricting provisions. HR 1 would, if enacted, make a whole series of changes to the congressional redistricting process. It would require that all states use non-politician commissions for congressional redistricting with even numbers of Democrats, Republicans, and unaffiliated members. It would prohibit the enactment of, quote, it would prohibit the enactment of maps that unduly favor or disfavor one political party over another. And it would establish a set of uniform rules for drafting maps, which would apply equally to all states. HR 1 has cleared the US House, but its fate in the US Senate remains uncertain.
All right, well, great. Thank you for fielding those questions, Jarek. I also want to thank Kayla Harris, our Senior Communications Associate, for the helpful graphics that were part of today's briefing. Ballotpedia will be following all these redistricting storylines, including deadlines, election dates, lawsuits, and more throughout the year and beyond. You can stay up to date by subscribing to our monthly newsletter, the Ballot Bulletin, which you can find on our website. We'll also be tracking changes on our page dedicated to state redistricting deadlines. That's called State Redistricting Deadlines After the 2020 Census on ballotpedia.org. And one more resource I want to plug is our page on the 2020 Census. It's a really neat page. You can find everything from historical information on the census to congressional apportionment projections, like we talked about earlier, and that is United States Census 2020 on Ballotpedia. And again, we invite you to donate to Ballotpedia. We'll be sending a YouTube link to all briefing attendees tomorrow in case you want to watch again or share it with your friends. Thanks a lot for watching, everyone.